Okay, picture this. The Supreme Court is literally about to drop a decision that could, poof, just vaporize a huge piece of the president's economic plan. We're talking about those sweeping emergency tariffs. And believe me, the stakes here, they could not be higher.
So let's play this out. What actually happens to the global economy, to American politics, to the whole balance of power in Washington if the court basically says, nope, the president went too far? Let's dive in and unpack it.
So first things first, you have to understand that this case is a huge constitutional showdown, one that's been brewing for decades, really.
Okay, so at its heart, the legal fight comes down to this really fundamental clash, right? You've got the president using this 1977 law. It's called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA for short. Now, this law was originally meant for things like targeted sanctions, but it's being used here to slap on these massive nationwide taxes on imports. The problem? Well, the Constitution is pretty darn clear that the power to tax belongs to Congress. So the big question for the Supreme Court is, can a president just declare a trade deficit in emergency to get around that?
And when we talk about what's at stake, well, the money involved is just staggering. We're talking about nearly $1.8 trillion over the next decade if these tariffs stay on the books. That is a massive number that touches every part of the U.S. economy.
All right, so the ruling drops. What's the very first thing that happens? Chaos. The first shockwave is going to be purely economic, and it starts the second these tariffs just vanish.
Now here's something you've really got to get. Not all of the administration's tariffs would disappear overnight. Things like the steel and aluminum tariffs, they'd probably stick around. But the IEEPA tariffs, the big ones like that 10% global tariff, they make up something like 70% of all the money coming in from this. So a ruling against them, yeah, that blows a giant hole in the entire policy.
So, with the tariffs suddenly declared illegal, the government now owes a ton of people a ton of money. Just for 2025 alone, we're talking about $80 to $90 billion that's already been collected. The source material uses this great phrase for what happens next: a bureaucratic avalanche hitting Customs and the Treasury Department as everyone rushes to get their money back.
And you know this process isn't going to be fair, right? You'll have these huge multinational corporations with armies of lawyers, and they'll be first in line ready to go. But what about the small businesses? The ones that really got hammered paying these costs in the first place? Well, they could easily get lost in all the paperwork, basically paying the price twice.
Okay, so as soon as that economic chaos starts, what comes next? The political battle, of course. The fight over the narrative kicks into high gear immediately.
You can already guess the spin from the administration, right? The loss gets framed as a grievance. The message will be something like, hey, I was fighting for you, for the American worker, but the deep state courts and a weak Congress stopped me. It's a classic move. Turn a legal defeat into a political rallying cry for the base.
And on the other side, Democrats and other critics are going to fire right back, focusing on the rule of law. Their whole argument will be, look, this was never really about being soft on China or trade strategy. It was about a president grabbing power that the Constitution doesn't give him. It's that classic separation of powers debate. Who actually gets to write the laws in this country?
But of course, this isn't just a fight happening inside the US. A ruling this big would send ripples all across the globe. The whole world would be watching.
For America's allies, countries that got hit by these tariffs, this would be a huge moment of vindication. It's a sign that, hey, American institutions can still put a check on executive power. Now, for a rival like China, it's a nice little propaganda win for them, for sure, but it's not a total game changer. Why? Because all the other stuff, the tech bans, the targeted tariffs, that's all likely staying in place.
But honestly, beyond the immediate headlines about trade and politics, the real lasting impact of a decision like this, it's about the future of presidential power itself. This is the big one.
See, the court would almost certainly lean on this thing called the major questions doctrine. Let me break that down for you. It basically means that if a president wants to do something with absolutely massive economic and political consequences, completely reshaping the entire U.S. trade system, they can't just dig up some vague phrase in a law from the 70s. Nope, they need clear, direct, explicit permission from Congress.
And this is where you really see the long-term domino effect. A precedent like this wouldn't just be about tariffs. It would make it so much harder for any future president, Republican or Democrat, to use these vague emergency powers for huge policy shifts on things like climate or tech regulation or financial sanctions, all without getting a specific new law passed by Congress.
Okay, so let's pull back one last time and just look at the biggest takeaway from this whole hypothetical situation. What does it all mean for America's place in the world?
At the end of the day, the world would probably see this ruling in two totally opposite ways. On one hand, some would look at it and say, wow, look, America's democratic institutions still work. The system can actually correct itself when a president goes too far. But others would see the exact same event and say it's a sign of paralysis, a nation so divided it can't even stick to a consistent economic plan. So that leaves us with the final massive question. Which is it? Does reigning in a president's power actually strengthen the republic, or does it just weaken America's ability to act decisively in a really chaotic world? That's the question that would hang in the air for years to come.